Hi cloudonaut crew, this is our first video and today we will talk about CloudWatch embedded metric format. This is a niche topic, but I think it could be very interesting for you when it comes to monitoring and observing your applications that are running on AWS. So my name is Andreas. Together with Michael, I'm running cloudonaut, and I'm deeply focusing on all things AWS, which means I'm having a look into infrastructure as code, into building applications for AWS, serverless or container-based. And yeah, I'm happy to share this with you, and I'm really happy that you joined the cloudonaut crew. Okay, so then let's get started. So what is CloudWatch embedded metric format all about? So the embedded metric format basically allows you to combine log messages with the metric data of your application. So instead of just logging log messages that are intended to be readable by a human, you are also appending metric data that is intended for in a machine readable format. So to get that working, you need to structure your log messages. You need to basically do JSON messages for log messages. And then you attach a custom data format that AWS specified to that. So you log a JSON message that could be a human readable part as well, but then you have structured data that is in a format that AWS understands, and especially the CloudWatch logs service understands. So that is what this is all about. And yeah, you really combine those things together, and that's the whole thing. So let's have a look at this diagram. So when we do combined metrics, embedded metrics format, we can send log messages from everywhere. So you can do it from a container, from any EC2 instance, from a function. You could even do that from on-premises if you really want to. And you send your log messages to CloudWatch logs with the embedded metrics format. And then what happens is CloudWatch does collect the incoming messages. It stores it in CloudWatch logs, but it also creates metrics, custom metrics, with the data that you have defined in the embedded metrics format. And what you can do with that is you can use the metrics, for example, to set up a CloudWatch alarm, which then allows you to notify an engineer. And an engineer can then also use the log messages with maybe human readable part or also the metrics part and analyze that, for example, with CloudWatch logs insights. And so, yeah, really the thing here is you combine those two things together. Log messages and metric data is no longer two different things. It's one thing, and you combine that together. And why is that beneficial? So the reason for that is you have more context when debugging. So when you get an alarm from a specific metric, you can easily filter for the log messages that correspond to those metric data and to the alarm. So that is a really cool thing. And also the embedded metric format is really easy to use, at least when you do it with Lambda. It gets a little bit more complicated when you do it from container workloads or from instances. But with Lambda, it is really easy to use. And this is something we will dive into next. I forgot to mention the costs of all of that. So that is important, obviously, when talking about any AWS service. So what's the cost for using CloudWatch logs and the embedded metric format? So first of all, with CloudWatch logs, you pay for data ingestion. So that is one part. So the more data you send to CloudWatch logs, the more you have to pay. And then you also pay for archiving that data. So you can define retention periods for CloudWatch log groups. For example, you can keep the data for 7 days or, I don't know, 3 years, whatever you want to. But you have to pay for the data that you consume, for the storage that you consume, which means you have to pay per gigabyte for the data archive that you have there. And then on top of that, when you use the embedded metric format, it creates so-called custom CloudWatch metrics for you out of the box. And each metric is 30 cents. So that is something you have to keep in mind. So you pay for that as well. So keep in mind that you're not creating too many metrics with too many dimensions. But if you have just a few, I think that's totally fine. a side note on that, when you use custom metrics without the embedded metric format, so if you just send your data to the API yourself, you also pay for putting data into a custom metric. So you pay per request. This is the put metric data request. But this is not, this does not apply when using embedded metric format. So in that case, you're not paying for the put metric data request here. So you're only paying per custom metric and nothing on top of that. So that is important to know. Okay, let's start at the first demo. So I want to show you how you can use the embedded metric format. And I want to start with a Lambda demo because I think that's the easiest way to use that. And I think it's even the most beneficial one. Okay, let's get started. So I'm switching to the AWS Management Console. And what I have in here is I have a Lambda function that I use as an example here to send log messages with the embedded metric format. So logging with Lambda function is easy. So this example is Node.js, but this is true for others as well. You just send your log messages to standard out, standard error, and CloudWatch will ship all the log messages to a CloudWatch log group automatically. And that's what happens here as well. So in my example, all I really do is I use a command to log to standard out. And as I told you, to make use of that embedded metric format, I'm not just sending a string as the log messages, but I'm sending a JSON object. So I'm logging a JSON object, and that allows CloudWatch to have that data structured and to extract the embedded metrics from it. So that's what I'm doing here. Okay, let's maybe go through that example a little bit. So what you can see, the log messages has a property that is called _AWS. This is basically the part where you define the CloudWatch metrics that you want to send to CloudWatch as well. So what we have in here, you have to define a timestamp. So that's a timestamp for the date for the data event that is coming into CloudWatch metrics, and then you define the CloudWatch metric. So the namespace. This is a custom CloudWatch namespace. I'm using CloudWatch EMF Lambda here. You can define dimensions. So dimensions allow you to dive into a metric more specifically. For example, I want to have a look at the metrics for a specific machine, for a specific region, for, I don't know, a specific version of my application. That's what you can use dimensions for. And then I'm defining the metrics that I want to send to CloudWatch metrics. And this is, in this case, I'm using it processing time, which is in milliseconds, and the status code, which is just a number. So what you can see here is I'm defining the names for the metrics. And what is important now, so this is all the AWS property, and this is an embedded object. And what you can see here is the values for that are also part of the object at the root level of the object, basically. So we have processing time, status code, region, and just by using the same name here, CloudWatch will then use that data and add it to the CloudWatch metric automatically. So for example, processing time, this is the name for the metric. And it has to be a property, a root property of the object that you do with the JSON object as well. So you can find that here, processing time, status code, and region. And on top of that, you can define whatever data you want. You can send JSON to it. Basically, you can have, for example, I'm using a message here. This can just be a human readable log message as you have been doing it before. Okay, so that is it. There is a specification for that embedded metric format. So there's a JSON schema that you have to use when sending log messages, and there's a documentation page from AWS where you can find all the information that you need to know to construct your own object here. So you'll find links to that in the video as well. Okay, so that is this is all about that. So let's see if that is working and how this is working actually. So I'm just pressing the test button here to invoke a few, to do a few invocations of my Lambda function. And as you can see, the output of that log message is just a JSON object because I'm logging that to standard out. So I'm just doing a few ones here. Okay, so that should be fine. And then let's switch to the CloudWatch log group that is attached to the Lambda function, because there we will find the log messages. So let's have a look at that quickly. Okay, so I'm searching through that log group. The last minute should be fine. So what you can find in here now is you find the log messages, and the log messages is not just a string, it's a JSON object, and that's why the CloudWatch, the management console already shows that as a structured data event coming in. So this is coming in here. It contains the processing time, the status code, the region, and also the human readable log message. So all combined into one JSON object that we have been logging to CloudWatch logs. Okay, so that's one part. But now the magic happens. So because we have defined this embedded metrics, CloudWatch will also create custom metrics for that. So I'm now switching to the metrics tab, and here you can see custom namespace CloudWatch EMF Lambda. So that is where we store these custom metrics. And remember, this was defined in the configuration object inside the embedded metric format. The namespace is CloudWatch EMF Lambda. That's exactly what we have here. Okay, what you can see here is there is metric data coming in for the processing time and also for the status code. So this arrived now as a CloudWatch metric, and we can use that to define a CloudWatch alarm. So you can just click here, action, create an alarm, trash, or this is the latency. And we can, for example, define when latency is above 1 second. We want to get alarmed, for example, by sending that message to an SNS topic. So that is how you can you send the CloudWatch log message with the metric included, and then you have a custom metric that you can use to define alarms. You can even scale based on that metric if you want to. So I think that's really handy. Okay, so we had a look into how to use the embedded metric format together with Lambda, and I told you this is the easy part. Next, I want to show you how to use it in another scenario. So I picked the scenario that I want to run NGINX on an EC2 instance, and I want to send the access logs of NGINX to CloudWatch logs and extract some metrics out of that with an embedded by using the embedded metric format. So a few things here. So first of all, it's a little bit tricky to do so because NGINX supports logging JSON messages, but it's not very flexible when it comes to creating those structured JSON log messages. And the other thing is, if you send CloudWatch logs with embedded metric format, you have to set a specific HTTP header so that CloudWatch logs really extract that data. So that does not happen, for example, by default when you use a CloudWatch unified agent or similar tools. So that is why I'm using FluentBit with a plugin for CloudWatch logs. This allows me to restructure the JSON message a little bit and then also to set that HTTP header that is needed for extracting the data, the EMF data, out of the log messages. So let's jump into that. So first of all, let me SSH into an EC2 instance. Okay, so here I did two things. So I thought I could just do it with NGINX, and that's why I started with that. So let us go to the NGINX config file. The NGINX config file here includes so this is part of the HTTP section, and this includes a custom log format that I specified here. So you can define your own log formats. You can tell NGINX to escape it as JSON, so that is useful for the values that are in there. And then you might already notice that log format structure. So I'm using the embedded metric format from AWS already. So you see the the AWS JSON property in here, followed by the structure that is needed with the CloudWatch log group name and the metrics. So very similar to what we had a look at with Lambda functions. I use another namespace here, so it's CloudWatch EMF EC2. I'm using also the region as a dimension, and I want to have the request time and the bytes sent. So those are two NGINX metrics, you could say, or log properties that you can use, and I want to send those two values to a CloudWatch metric. So that's why I define that here. And what I then have to do is I have to add the data to the root of the JSON object as well. So the request, the status is not needed for the metric, but this is just for debugging purposes. And then the bytes sent and the request time, those are the two properties that I then also extract as a CloudWatch metric. So that is what you can see from above. So that is one part of the whole thing. So when we have a look now into, let's go to var log NGINX access. So this is where I'm sending that in. So you can see here in a very unstructured way the JSON log messages that NGINX has now created and sent to this file. So I thought I can just forward that to CloudWatch logs, but unfortunately, yeah, as I said, it's not that flexible. And that is why I'm using FluentBit. So this is a service that runs on that machine as well. And let's have a look into the configuration of that as well. Yeah, let's start with the configuration. So FluentBit, so this is similar to FluentD or other log parsing and manipulating tools. You define a chain for your log messages. So you can see here I'm defining the input. The input is just a file, so I'm just collecting the messages that are coming in here. I'm having a filter in that case that runs a Lua script. So Lua is a scripting engine, very simple to use, where you can, very basic stuff, manipulate the log messages that are coming in. We will dive into that in a second. And then I'm defining an output. And the output is using a CloudWatch logs plugin provided by AWS for FluentBit. And so I have to define the log group name, I have to define the region. And what is important is the log format is JSON EMF, so embedded metric format. So that sets the header when sending that log messages to CloudWatch logs, so that then CloudWatch is extracting the metric data. So that is important here. Okay, so yeah, that's all. It reads the log messages. There's a filter which manipulates that a little bit, and then it sends it to CloudWatch. So this is the job of FluentBit on this machine. Okay, I've written a very simple Lua script that is manipulating the JSON message a little bit, because with NGINX I was not flexible enough to do so. So what I'm doing is basically, you don't have to understand that code here, but what it tells you, this is a scripting language. It's not that hard to learn, and you can just manipulate the incoming object. So the object that is coming in is called record, and I'm creating a new object and restructuring that a little bit. So for example, I'm setting the region, and I'm manipulating the timestamp a little bit so that it is in the correct format, because yeah, AWS, the embedded metric format is very strict. So how you have to structure the data and how, for example, the milliseconds have to show up in the data. Yeah, so that is what I'm doing here. I'm transforming strings to integer values as well. And then I'm returning that manipulated object. And then this gets sent to CloudWatch logs. So this is what you can do with the Lua scripting part in here. So that's quite flexible. So yeah, FluentBit seems to be an interesting choice here. Probably not the only one, but one choice that you can have. Okay. Yeah. So so we have that running. So I showed you already the log messages from NGINX, and so these are the access logs. And now let's jump to the AWS management console to see the results in there as well. So I have a log group for CloudWatch EMF EC2 in here, and let's have a look at that. So what you can see here is the log messages are coming in that structured format as we told it. So we have byte sent, request time, everything in here. And this is already in the structure that we need for CloudWatch logs. And that's why when I go to metrics, we have the custom namespace CloudWatch EMF EC2 here as well. And in here, we will find the data that is coming in as well. So that is quite useful. So let's have a look at an example data here. Did some testing, and yeah, so I think that is really interesting to have a look into the metrics that are coming in here. So the request time, the traffic that was caused by those requests. So I think that is quite handy. So we have extracted the data from the log messages and created metrics with it. So yeah, pretty cool stuff, I think. Okay, there's one last thing I want to show you, and this is how to use CloudWatch logs insights, which is basically a more advanced query and visualization language for CloudWatch logs to make use of that structured log data as well. And basically now it comes together that you have metrics and CloudWatch logs in one place. So they're combined, so it gets really easy to debug and search for certain things. So let's dive into that. Okay, so let's go to CloudWatch logs insights. So this is, by the way, I have to mention that you're paying for that. So you're paying for the queries that you're running on logs insights. That's why they are also faster, because you pay for the infrastructure. So I think it's worth the money. But you have to be a little bit careful on the amount of data that you're analyzing. So make sure you are having a look at the right time frame and not fetching too much data. Okay, so let's have a look into what is coming in from the EC2 instance here. So this looks similar to what we have seen already. So the log message here comes in, and what CloudWatch logs insight is doing, it already fetches the information of the structured log messages and converts it into their own format so that we can search for it, for example. I have a little bit of a more advanced query in here. So let me go through that quickly. So these are the fields that we are showing. We also want to create a visualization. That's why I'm summing up the bytes sent in 5-minute buckets here. So that is interesting if you want to graph the data on the custom granularity. And I'm filtering. So because we have a structured log message, we can now filter on specific parameters or properties of the log message. So for example, I'm filtering only if region is EU West 1, and only if the request time is below 1 second. So that is something you can do. So by doing so, you can really filter only the log messages that correspond with a certain issue. For example, status code, response time, what have you, maybe path or something. And that really makes it easy to only have a look at the log messages that are interesting for you. And at the end, I'm sorting that everything a little bit. Okay, so let's run that query. And what we get here is we really now have an idea of the data that we have been sending in a specific time frame, and you can have a visualization that tells you, okay, in this 5 minutes, we have sent that amount of data with NGINX. And I think this is really useful for debugging problems, the combination of metrics and logs in one place. Really cool stuff. So if you're used to an ELK stack, so Elasticsearch and Kibana, this is coming into the same direction a little bit. Okay, so we have been going through 2 demos. So I showed you how to use the embedded metric format with Lambda function, which is very simple. And I showed you an example with NGINX, which you can basically apply to any kind of workloads. So just for you to have an idea of that, how that works. So what did I find out while preparing the demos and while working with the embedded metric format? So one thing that is a pity is Docker comes with built-in logs drivers. One of them is AWS logs. This is, for example, used when you use ECS to send your log data to CloudWatch immediately. And unfortunately, the built-in log driver, AWS logs, does not support EMF out of the box. So that is, you cannot simply log your log messages in JSON, and then this shows up in CloudWatch logs with EMF as you do with Lambda, but instead you have to use something like FluentBit to parse the message and then to send it to CloudWatch logs with JSON EMF as the data type that you're sending in. That's a little bit frustrating. That would be cool stuff, but I think that is maybe a little bit difficult for AWS to achieve because the logs driver are probably managed by Docker and it's probably hard to get in there. But yeah, so you have to use another tool for that. And then I think FluentBit is an interesting option nowadays, but I found it not that flexible for restructuring your JSON messages. That is why I ended up with the Lua scripting part, because that really gives you much flexibility. So if you're not fine with writing Lua scripts, you should maybe check out FluentD instead or some other tools that process log messages. So that's interesting, I think. Yeah, so maybe alternatives. So what's similar to the embedded metric format? So I already mentioned the ELK stack. So if you use Amazon Elasticsearch Service or something similar, then basically you can already send JSON structured messages and have metrics, alarms, and everything defined with that. But what I like about CloudWatch logs and CloudWatch metrics is you're only paying what you're using. You don't have to operate huge clusters of Elasticsearch to process your log messages. You consume that as a service. So I think that's maybe interesting. CloudWatch metric filter, by the way, does a similar thing. So you can have, you can send CloudWatch logs to CloudWatch and then define a filter that extracts a CloudWatch metric out of that. But this only, with each filter, you can only create one metric. So I think the embedded metric format is much more flexible here. And I think that's probably a lot easier to use. So thanks a lot. This was our first video about the CloudWatch embedded metric format. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you can use that in your day-to-day work and improve the things you do on AWS. So if you have any questions or you want to leave feedback, I encourage you to join us in the cloudonaut community, where we have a special area only for cloudonaut crew members. So this is the perfect place to get in touch with us, so Michael and me, but also the rest of the crew. So ask your questions there about CloudWatch embedded metric format or anything else AWS related. We are happy to help. Or if you want to have a more personal conversation, feel free to send me an email or a message on Slack. That's also a very good way to reach me. Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot for being part of the cloudonaut crew. And we will be back next week with an online event and the week after with another video. So see you there. Bye.